Great. Thank you, Justin, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about gigatons of ice and what that means in my research context and how we apply those units to understand mass transfer in the ice sheets. So I just want to go over quickly kind of the outline for today. The first part, which is the majority of the talk, is going to be spent on kind of the science and what we're learning about ice sheet dynamics as we improve our technology to observe them. So looking at things like the underlying processes on fine timescales, so looking at from weekly to monthly changes, as well as longer term time series, multi-annual decadal records. And then we're also going to map gigatons even after the ice breaks off from the ice sheet. So talking about what I'll introduce as mélange and how even after the ice can calve off of glaciers, it can still impact ice dynamics. And then the third part is kind of looking ahead to how we can combine both high resolution elevation change and velocities together to start getting really refined, reconciled estimates of total ice sheet mass change. I'm not sure we're going to get to this one today because I want to make sure we have time for the second part, a few minutes to talk about communicating these big numbers. And when we're talking about gigatons and ice sheets, how we communicate that within the scientific community, and then also promoting polar literacy amongst the greater public. So I'm aiming for 3 out of the 4 of these topics today. But so just to start here, I thought we would have this kind of cute little animation. It doesn't have the audio with it today, but just what is an ice sheet and what are glaciers 101? And so an ice sheet, we have 2, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. Those grow and form over time as snow accumulates. And once enough snow accumulates, it compacts into ice, and it will actually start to flow out under its own weight toward the edges. And so at the margins or edges of the ice sheet, this is what we think of as glaciers or conveyor belts of ice, the flowing formations of ice that's being drawn down from the thick interior. And those we refer to as outlet glaciers. And to kind of show you what one of these look like in real life. Real life. One second, sorry. See if I can turn that sound off. It's a little fuzzy. Let's play this one first. So this is a footage from a plane that we are flying over the calving front of the largest glacier in Western Greenland. If you can kind of see this really bright white line around here, that is the calving front. So that's where the ice actually calves off from the glacier and then becomes individual pieces of ice or icebergs within the fjord. And so it's really hard to get a sense of scale when you're looking at a map, but these are enormous blocks of ice. In this glacier alone, being one of the largest in terms of how much ice it drains from the ice sheet, this glacier alone drains about 40 to 50 gigatons of ice every year. And then just again playing this is going over individual icebergs here. So one of these icebergs can be the size of small cities, anywhere from about half a gigaton to a full gigaton of ice, sometimes if they're really, really large pieces of ice. And before I get too ahead of myself, though, talking about gigatons, I should introduce what that unit is. And so we, as glaciologists, use gigatons to describe ice sheet-wide mass change. And a gigaton is a mass unit equivalent to 1 billion metric tons. So if we zoom out and look at the 2 ice sheets as a whole, the Greenland ice sheet contains about a little less than 3 million gigatons. So I'll let you kind of make all those conversions in your head, but 3 million gigatons of ice. But it's only a fraction of the size of the Antarctic ice sheet, which is a little less than 30 million gigatons of ice. And so why does this matter? Well, one of the big uncertainties that remain in sea level rise projections, of course, are these low likelihood, high impact events that can happen with the ice sheet. So this is, although we don't expect them to happen, they're low likelihood. If these processes were to happen, this is talking about like rapid ice sheet change, a lot of these processes have to do in Antarctica, but if these processes were to happen, it has a high impact or high potential to increase sea level rise rapidly. And this is just from the most recent IPCC report going out to 2100. But if we actually extend further out even to the next few hundred years, you can see this uncertainty range goes even greater. So there's still a lot we need to learn about how these ice sheets behave, the underlying dynamics, so that we can kind of constrain this uncertainty and start to really be more confident in how much sea level rise we should expect going forward. And so fortunately, this modern era of satellite coverage and satellite data sets coming in, we have no shortage of observations that we can really get down into the detail of how these ice sheets are changing over a multiple of timescales. In today's talk, I'm going to be just focusing on Greenland. As much as I just said how much larger Antarctica is than Greenland, my research focuses on the Greenland ice sheet, so we're gonna stay there today. But this is just showing a combination of different satellites and different types of observations that we and I use personally to understand how ice mass is changing. So this includes sensors that can tell us how the ice surface speed is changing, so changes in ice velocity, as well as how the ice is thinning through time. You might notice here this 2015 Sentinel. This was really revolutionary for understanding high speed changes, so talking weekly to monthly dynamics, because we get repeats quite often. Every 6 to 12 days, we get kind of a snapshot view of what the ice sheet is doing. So getting that continuous high resolution coverage has really transformed how we understand ice sheet change. So velocities, these are all the different types of velocities on the top, and then as well as changes in ice thickness. So if we can tell how the surface elevation is changing, subtract what we know about the bed topography, we get a thickness estimate there. And what's not on here under velocity is the upcoming NISAR mission. That's a NASA mission planned to launch soon. And so that will also be really valuable for having continuous high resolution radar images of the ice sheet. And so let's see if this will play. I want to kind of show you what these time series look like once we start compiling all these satellite data sets. So this is just zooming in on a few interesting outlets across different regions of Greenland. This top brightly colored map here, this is a velocity mosaic. This is from the GRIMP project. This is a mosaic of all the different scenes where we're getting how the ice is flowing or the speed of the ice along all these edges. Some interesting features pop out. You can see there's some areas where faster flow actually extends quite far inland. This is the northeast ice stream here. Hopefully you can see my pointer. But once you aggregate all of these sequential images, you get really detailed ideas of the dynamics at play. You see these glaciers flowing. You get kind of that sense of what we mean when we talk about conveyor belts of ice. That ice is drawn down, it calves off, and you may notice if you have kind of a detail or an eye for detail, that these icebergs then stay within the fjord. They don't immediately drift out to the ocean. Sometimes they move as an aggregate mixture, which we will get back to here in a little bit. So why is it important then to have all these observations? Well, if we know how fast the ice is flowing, and we know how thick the ice is and how that thickness and velocity change over time, we can get detailed records then of how much volume is being drained through these outlet glaciers. And this has been done for quite a while. So combining changes in ice thickness and velocity to get what's called ice discharge. And so this is an approach that we call the input-output method. It's basically adding up all the input, which is snow accumulation, and then minus all the output, which is this volume of ice drained through these outlet glaciers. And so I want to just show kind of how these observations have changed over time. And most of this change is directly a result of having an improved capability to observe these changes in higher and more detailed resolution. And so these orange observations here, these were multi-year estimates of how much ice discharge was leaving these glaciers, and this is Eric Renault's paper in 2008. Ellen Enderlin's paper in 2014 is in the background. So now we're getting, instead of a multi-year average, we're getting annual averages. And so if we're looking at the total discharge coming from the ice sheet, this is on the order of about 500 gigatons, but it does vary every year. Now, if we kind of jump forward, these are 3 different studies just within the past few years. So again, a reflection of how technology is sort of an exponential growth curve, right? Now that we have a lot more rich data sets, we can get more detailed observations, more refined estimates, longer time scales, longer time series of change. And one thing that you'll note here with the blue and then the kind of hot pink colors is that now we're getting, in addition to just an annual estimate, we're getting more of that seasonal change. And you'll kind of notice like a spike every year. It sort of looks like an EKG. That's actually the ice discharge, or the total volume being drained actually increases in the summertime. And so that summertime amplitude is on the order of about 20 to 30 gigatons. What that means is that on average, the ice sheet is losing 500 gigatons a year. It actually varies from, plus or minus 30 gigatons, depending on what time of year it is. So there's sort of this like pulse where the ice sheet shrugs off a little more extra ice in the summer. And so if we kind of zoom in at those spikes, what's going on in the summer? Well, of course, in the Greenland ice sheet, there's a lot of surface melt. It gets warm enough that in some really anomalous years, even the entire surface has some melt, but all that water has to go somewhere. And so as that surface meltwater drains to the margins of the ice sheet, it can interact with the dynamics, both through when it drains beneath the ice, and then also when it comes out through these outlet glaciers on the edge, kind of undercuts that calving front and can impact calving dynamics that way as well. Just going to get one sip of water here. And so we've been talking about gigatons a lot, and I kind of want to show you what that looks like on an individual glacier scale. So if we kind of zoom in to a large basin, and when I talk about basin, I'm basically saying this is where if water were to fall within this basin, it would drain out to this outlet. So everywhere that's shaded in the blue, this is a really, really large basin. Think of it like a hydrologic basin that's draining out to a large glacier in northeast Greenland, Zachariah Eastrom. And so if we were to kind of combine all the total runoff, or the melt that forms in this basin and then runs off, it's about 2 to 3 fold gigaton increase in discharge in the summer. So what that means is that because of this runoff, because of the surface melt that's occurring, it's promoting a faster flow of this outlet glacier near the margins, and it kind of speeds up this outlet glacier. And if you kind of squint, you can see here, I combined a bunch of different velocity data products. This is RadarSat. We also have optical, Landsat imagery, Sentinel, Terrasar, a bunch of different satellite missions essentially that combine either optical or radar imagery to understand how fast the ice is flowing. And you kind of see that they do generally agree pretty well, where you get these nice, really sharp spikes in the summer. And this is one example where it's like the seasonal cycle is just so pronounced and really confined. I mean, it doesn't speed up for months and months. It's really just a couple months in the summer where you have that really strong spike. And again, going back to these gigaton numbers, I want to just kind of pound it to the ground through this talk today is I mentioned how much runoff is within a basin, about 1 gigaton of runoff produced over that entire basin. But that 1 gigaton of runoff promotes an accelerated flow, an accelerated draining of that glacier, and it actually increases by 2 to 3 gigatons. 2 to 3 gigatons of actual ice volume being drained because of this 1 gigaton of runoff input. So kind of an interesting way to think about it there. Now this, I'm going to zoom in on an interesting glacier in central west Greenland, Upernavik Eastrom Glacier. This is I love this glacier because it's really 4 tributaries or 4 branches that come together into this larger basin here. And so if we're looking at this image, the ice is draining from right to left. You can kind of see there's some rock and a bunch of bergy bits here. And so I mentioned how the summertime is typically associated with this extra shrugging off of ice, right? There's a pulse of increased draining from the ice sheet in the summer, but that is not a consistent signal across the ice sheet. And so even if we zoom in on an area, several branches of a glacier that are really proximal to each other, so a similar regional area, you'll note that there's a large variance in how that seasonal signal is shown. And so I'm going to zoom in here. Don't need to pay so much attention to the red. That's just showing the runoff, so in the summer. But the black line is showing the average velocity over the year. So these two southern branches have a steady increase in velocity, so they speed up and then they decelerate come the melt season. And so those two are very similar. But if we compare that to the two northern branches, they're completely different. And so even though these glaciers are only kilometers, tens of kilometers apart from each other, they have very unique and distinct seasonal signals. So that's kind of something I want you to kind of keep in mind going forward to this next part, because one thing that scientists and glaciologists are really interested in is trying to understand what controls the timing of these dynamics and what controls the timing of how these glaciers accelerate, retreat, or advance. And so going then to this next part here, mapping these gigatons of ice even after the crack is what I'm kind of coining this here. So even after the glacier calves off these large icebergs, how do they impact the seasonality of the upstream dynamics? What I mean is that if we look at the areas of the fjord where ice breaks off as icebergs, kind of clogs the fjord, can it have an impact then on that seasonality that we're seeing upstream? And so that mixture of bergy bits that I've kind of been alluding to or hinting to these last few moments, we call that mélange, which I think is a French for mixture, so it's a appropriate use of the term. But if you kind of look here, and it'll be easier to see once I start the animation, but the combination of sea ice kind of acts as a glue and holds the larger icebergs together. And together, it's almost like a static or semi-static sort of aggregate mixture that can flow together. So instead of just having individual icebergs that are moving through the fjord, if they're stuck together with a bunch of sea ice, and maybe there's a ton of icebergs just all over the place, it really is kind of a cohesive mixture. And so let's look at kind of how that varies through time in a glacier. Allison Glacier is in Northwest Greenland. And so the calving front is right here. So that's where the ice breaks off from the ice sheet. And you'll see there actually is a couple really large icebergs. A couple of them actually just broke off. But it takes some time. So every image here is about 6 days. So this is, months of time is lapsing as we go through this animation. And so those icebergs hang around for quite a while. And that can vary depending on the fjord geometry, how long do they have to travel before they're out to sea into the open water, how cold the water is, how long sea ice persists, how long that glue is there. But this can have a really profound impact on the calving dynamics of this glacier, because if there's a lot of mélange kind of suffocating the fjord or clogging the fjord, it'll make it more difficult, or it will help inhibit the calving of larger icebergs from the front. And so the kind of the way that we look at this first is that the approach is to kind of map mélange motion, or map the extent of mélange, or if I kind of go back here, the extent, if we are going to consider this sort of the mélange, can we get a handle on how mélange varies over time and start to understand if it does in fact correlate with changes in the calving front positions. And so just like I showed how we can use imagery from satellite data sets to understand how fast the ice is flowing, we can apply those same techniques to understand how the mélange is flowing. So we're treating mélange almost like an extended part of the glacier. And so this is that same Upernavik 4 branches here, that glacier. And so if we look first at an image, and then we can see if we're doing just the traditional velocity mapping techniques, so looking at features on the surface and how they change over time and driving up velocity or speed from that, displacement from looking at features and how they progress over subsequent images, we'll get a really nice velocity map. So this is showing us where the ice is flowing fastest. But we can, just similarly with some tuning, apply those same methods to the mélange itself, as long as the mélange is moving in a relatively cohesive manner. So if we are able to kind of keep track of the individual constituents of the mélange, you're able to derive a nice velocity map similarly to how you would on grounded ice. And that's kind of what this is showing here. And so if we're looking up at this like northwest branch here, you can see that the mélange is actually moving quite quickly. It's probably flushing out away from the front. And you can kind of compare that to the velocities at some of the mélange fields in the southern branches as well. And then we can isolate the mélange velocity separate from the actual grounded ice and say, okay, this is what the downstream of the mélange in the fjord is doing. This is how it's flowing over time. And I kind of mentioned this in talking about if the individual constituents of the mélange are, if we're able to track those through time. What that means is that we need to have an inherent rigidity to the mélange. And rigidity doesn't, here I don't mean that it has a lot of inherent strength, but that it's rigid in that the flow or the field of mélange is moving as one unit. And so you may have instances where mélange is flowing, but it's flowing, maybe there's a bunch of different pieces of it, or a big part of the mélange broke off, or maybe the sea ice is weak and the icebergs are just allowed to kind of go wherever they please. If that's the case, it'll be really difficult for these methods to actually derive a velocity over the mélange. And so these techniques only work if the mélange is a cohesive flow, or kind of bound together as one unit. And so just to kind of compare these two types of rigid versus non-rigid mélange, these areas up here where I have labeled rigid, this mélange as it flows, those icebergs are kind of flowing together. They're moving at similar speeds and directions relative to each other. And so that will be able to drive a velocity map from that. But compared to the southern branch here, that's not the case. So it's maybe a weaker mélange, or the mélange is moving in several different directions. And so you don't get a velocity map back from that. All right, and so why does this matter? Why are we even talking about mélange in the first place? Well, there's three motivations for wanting to understand what the mélange is doing. A lot of previous papers have found that mélange does play an important role in controlling the timing of retreat cycles at glaciers. So if the mélange blows out, or once the mélange isn't there, that allows large seasonal retreat to happen. And then when there is a lot of mélange, that's typically associated with times where the glacier will advance. So if the fjord is chock full of mélange, it's really rigid, it's kind of stabilizing the front, it allows that glacier to advance. And so what we've started to do then is applying these velocity mapping methods over the mélange and understanding how mélange varies over weeks and months to different years. And so this is an example. This is another glacier in northwest Greenland. This is a heat map basically showing how many days of year we've found rigid mélange in front of the glacier. So you can just see from one year to the next, there's a lot of variability. In 2021, the mélange extended further out from the front. And other than that, it's sort of similar spatial patterns you see where there's more mélange coverage closer to the front. That kind of makes sense. That's the first place the mélange would form, because that's where the icebergs are calving. And you can get kind of nice annual differences maps there. And at this particular glacier, if we look at how this relates to the timing of advance and retreat, or where that front moves out, extends in the fjord, or calves back, there's actually a really close correlation. We're going to be looking again, this glacier right up here. And then we're looking, here's the front. Just kind of have that playing in the background there. So if we compare just those couple of years that I showed to, see if it'll go here. All right, and so if we look at how that mélange coverage relates to the timing of advance and retreat, we quickly see that mélange presence is really closely associated when the glacier is advancing. And so this black line here in this plot As the black line moves up on the y-axis, that means the glacier is advancing, and then down on the y-axis means there's retreat happening. And the green colors indicate that there is mélange there, and the darker the green, that means it's more a larger extent of mélange. So the mélange extends further out into the fjord. And so just from kind of eyeballing this here, you see that, yes, there is the green areas coincide with when there's mélange, and that's when the glacier is also advancing. The second motivation for studying mélange is to understand how anomalous mélange coverage, so if we're looking at what's a typical mélange coverage in a given year and identifying when one year might be unusual, this can play a role in priming really large dramatic calving events. And this is one example here in Allison Glacier, sticking in the Northwest. I wanted to kind of show this analysis started in 2015. And so these arrows on this timeline here are showing when mélange typically breaks up, or the time of year that at this glacier, you see kind of mélange breaking up for the year. And when I say breaking up, some glaciers, you don't have a very gradual mélange breakup, or these icebergs don't gradually drift out to sea. Instead, the mélange might be kind of rigid until one point where it all flushes out completely. And looking from June 9th, 2021 to June 15th, 2021, I know it's kind of hard to see in these images, but this whole area here where it's a little bit darker, that's rigid mélange. And then within 6 days, you see it's all, the whole fjord is light. So that whole mélange, the rigid mélange blew out within less than a week. However, if we look at how that compares to previous years, 2015, that blowing out or that big mélange flushing event happened in mid-July. 2016, 2017, similarly around mid-July, a little bit earlier. 2018, 19, and 20, a few days earlier still. So you see there is kind of a trend in the timing that this flushing event happens. But then 2021, this flushing event happened in mid-June. So anomalously early compared to the most recent years. And another way to look at that, again, at these heat maps, the more bright orangey yellow colors mean there's more coverage as far as how many days out of the year there's rigid mélange there. Compared to 2021, when there was that early flushing event, the darker colors indicate that mélange was present in those cells for less days out of that year. And so not only did the mélange flush out early, but it's also because it flushed out early, there's rigid mélange in place for a smaller time frame. And so what was actually, how did that impact the glacier itself? Well, if we look at historically the changes in the terminus or the changes in the calving front position at this glacier, starting about 50 years ago in the dark purple, all the way to present or near present in the yellow, you see that this glacier has retreated dramatically over time. And there was a few places where the retreat was more pronounced, but in general, it was kind of this steady retreat over time. However, just later than that same year, 2021, so a couple months after the mélange flushed out, from August 23rd to August 29th, if you kind of see in this area here, which I will highlight, if we can kind of, oops, sorry about that. Okay, so here we go. We've tracing the area that calved, and this calved within between two images, so two sentinel images. So within 6 days, this large area, over 2 kilometers of ice calved. And it's hard to say, this ice might have been close to flotation already and primed for calving. However, the fact that they had an earlier, much earlier flushing of that mélange that allowed more calving to happen probably helped encourage just how large this calving event was. And this is the largest calving event on record for this glacier. And it actually made the most inland retreat position the furthest retreat that we know that this glacier has been on record. And then finally, the third motivation for studying mélange is that we are starting to understand that mélange and the impact it can have. So whether or not mélange is important seems to be really related to the geometry of an individual fjord. So you can think if a glacier terminates sort of out in a bay, so maybe not within a narrow confined fjord at all, it's going to be difficult to form melange because there's no structure kind of helping hold the individual icebergs back. So it's easier for ice and sea ice to kind of float out to sea. However, if you're in a really narrow confined fjord, it makes it easier for those boundary stresses to come into play and just to kind of consolidate all of that melange mixture into place. And one interesting case study of this was a paper just came out last month, led by my colleague, Tom Chudley. And this looked at a glacier in eastern Greenland, a Steenstrup glacier. This glacier had a dramatic, like unprecedented amount of change that occurred just over a few years. The glacier thinned by about 200 meters. It had 7 kilometers of retreat. So again, I know these are just numbers, but this is something we'd only really seen at those really large glaciers in Greenland, that Kangerlussuaq, Helheim. I mean, this is one for the books as far as how large these changes were and the rate that the change occurred. It sped up, so the glacier, following the retreat, it sped up 3 to 4 times its initial speed. And because of that, there was a near doubling of ice discharge. So again, talking about that volume. So now this glacier is draining double the amount of ice that was previously. And because of all this change happening, this glacier used to be kind of just a middle of the road glacier. It wasn't doing anything too crazy. But now this glacier is in the top 10 percentile of, or the 90th percentile of how much ice it drains. So comparing it to 200 or so other glaciers in Greenland, now this is actually an important one because of all these changes that happened and led to this glacier draining much more ice. But what's one important thing I want to point out then about this glacier is that it did not used to form melange. And it might be a little challenging to see in this image here, but here's the front, this black line here. And so the other colors that extend in front of the front, this is all melange. And before, the glacier extended all the way out to the edge, so it was really difficult for melange to form. But now that the glacier has retreated back into this narrow fjord, we're seeing melange come into play, and we're seeing that melange is actually related then to the timing now of advance and retreat. So this is an example of under a scenario where a glacier undergoes a rapid reconfiguration and the geometries of the glacier are completely different. Now the role of melange is important. And so again, it seems like the fjord geometry is a really integral part in predicting how much of a role melange plays in glacier dynamics. I am going to skip this third part here, just so I can talk about communicating gigatons and what this means in a broader context, and then we'll open the floor for any questions. Okay. And so the first part of, and this is me kind of trying to figure out the best ways to go about communicating the science, both within the scientific community and then out to the broader general public. But of course, I'm trying to learn as I go, so I'm open ears if people have different types of approaches that have worked for them or solutions that they found were really on point. So I hope that this can be kind of just more of a dialogue discussion here. But before we get to the part where we're engaging with the public, we really need to communicate within the scientific community. And there's been a lot of initiatives just in the last few years to promote open science, right? And promote open dialogue and sharing of tools and findings and workflows and scripts. You know, a lot of people use Jupyter notebooks now to really make this a well-oiled machine, right? And to help science be conducted in a way that's really efficient and that we're not duplicating efforts when it's unnecessary. And so I want to kind of plug the GRIMP products and tools. So GRIMP stands for the Greenland Ice Mapping Project. This is a NASA Measures funded project led by PIs at UW and also at Ohio State. And so this is this project includes a bunch of different data sets. I'll show a couple of examples here. This is both optical and radar derived imagery. So I showed those velocity maps, but from both optical as well as radar. And these are available on monthly, 6-day, monthly, quarterly, or annual mosaics. You can get kind of like a an average over the time period of your interest. So in addition to velocity maps, again, you have imagery. So that was an example kind of here. Also digital elevation models. So looking at how the surface has changed over time, or having a reference digital elevation model, which is really important for a lot of velocity processing. And then also terminus positions for most large outlet glaciers. And these are updated on quarterly to annual basis. So you can get shape files of what those terminus traces look like, or where the most recent margin of the ice sheet is as each glacier changes over time. And then going forward, we would like to start including maps of where ridge and mélange is. So showing those same applications earlier, where we're mapping the motion of the mélange, using those to kind of get masks of where do we have ridge and mélange in a given year, how prevalent is it? So how many days out of a year do we have ridge and mélange, and how extensive is that mélange? Because we really need a baseline data set like this to start understanding, has mélange changed over time, and is it an important part of understanding the seasonality of ice sheet dynamics? So as part of this, I hope this doesn't have, I think I took the sound off. So we've developed, I really wasn't involved with this too much, mostly testing the notebooks, make sure things worked, but Ian Gigaton developed these notebooks that kind of coincide with the different GRIMP tool sets and GRIMP data products. They have a lot of metadata and descriptions that kind of walk you through how you can easily access the different data products, maybe subset, grab an example, look at it, throw it back, maybe download if you like, in a bunch of really neat plotting routines that you can start just, anyone with a NASA Earth data login, which I think is pretty easy to get, can then access and play with this data and plot, what's changing on the Greenland ice sheet in real time. Let's see, just a couple. Oh yeah, there's a kind of example there. You can get really quick, nice velocity maps without actually having to download any local data if you don't like to. So a lot of this can be done in the cloud or in Binder. And I just want to kind of mention that this is only one of several ongoing initiatives. CryoCloud is led by Tasha Snow at Mines. This is kind of this big cloud effort so that collaborators and glaciologists and polar scientists can all work together in the cloud. There's GHub, there's Greenland, which is a QGIS package that brings together a lot of Greenland data sets. GRIMP is one example of Greenland ice sheet data product. There's also ItsLive, which is a global glacier velocity data set. IcePix is tools. So there's a lot out here, and I tried to put together this schematic to kind of think through how the different tools and data sets and hubs and clouds kind of all fit together. But the bottom line is, or the point I'm trying to make, is there's a lot of community efforts at play to try to sort of consolidate our efforts and make sure we're doing reproducible, open source science that kind of brings on as many people as possible and maximizes work effort. All right, and then last couple slides here. So really trying to communicate these numbers, or what the changes in the ice sheet are, to folks that maybe don't have a concept of what the polar regions look like, which of course many people do not get a chance to go to some of these more remote places. This can present a challenge because it is a very unique landscape, and these are very kind of unique numbers and processes, but they're so important. So we need to kind of find a way then to make this a more tangible concepts for people to care about. And so of course there's different like hands-on actual education initiatives. This was a fun one just this last year, of course, the glacier goo. It's not slime. I was told actually by one of the students here that there's a different word for slime. Slime is a very specific thing, so it wasn't slime, but kind of understanding how a glacier flows and just getting that concept sort of understood early on. There's also ways to kind of incorporate written and art mediums. So there was an initiative based out of Rutgers, the Polar Literacy Collaborative Project, and NSF sponsored project that kind of did profiles of different scientists. There were artists that worked on these really cool really cool cartoons that go along, kind of showing like what tools scientists use, and a narrative that goes along with why someone likes being a scientist. And they cover people from diverse backgrounds so that for those watching, it sort of brings people on board. Like there shouldn't be so many barriers to becoming a scientist, and it's not a really abstract thing, right? So making it a more approachable kind of idea surrounding polar science. And I really like this one over here. This was an artist from Bird Polar and Climate Research Center, Maria Burns. She put together a scientist snapshot set of coloring pages. So this is for like students to kind of start coloring pages or seeing different scientists in the field and what kind of tools they use. So again, getting this up to be a more familiar type of job or careers people have, and more familiar tool sets. And I think my favorite is VR tutorials or VR explorations of remote landscapes. So this is one from the South Pole. This is led by Bird Polar as well. And so oftentimes when scientists go in the field, we take our cameras and sometimes our GoPros. So using that footage to actually compile sort of an interactive tour where people can sort of explore and move around. This is within the South Pole Station, and find, you can click on little blurbs, understand what the different things that you see in the footage are, walk around, learn some more. We found this to be a really great way to engage people with polar landscapes, polar fieldwork, and start understanding when we talk about these tools and these numbers, this is actually makes it a more, again, a more tangible way to kind of understand polar science when you're able to actually virtually move around different remote landscapes. And so those are a few ways I've kind of found to be fruitful as far as getting people into polar science or excited about it, as well as helping these concepts resonate a little more. But I'm always trying to learn more. So if anyone has, suggestions or ideas too, I would love to hear from you. But with that, I think I'm about the 45-minute mark. So I will open the floor for any questions if you have them. So thank you so much for your attention today.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Michalea. It's a fascinating collection of results and efforts there. Lots to dig into. So for those of you tuning in live today, if you do have a question for our speaker, please go ahead and enter that into the Q&A box, and I'd be happy to read those aloud for Michalea to respond to. Just to start with, I had a couple questions of my own that I thought I might toss your way. And at the beginning of your presentation, you had mentioned several different satellites that provide critical data for monitoring ice sheets over time. And I'm wondering, do you use any ground-based observations to complement or constrain the satellite data? And if so, what kind of ground-based observations are helpful?
Yeah, so I think this was the slide you were talking about. I would say my usage of ground-based observations are minimal compared to the use of satellite or air-based products. However, they do play a pretty critical role in ground truthing where we do have in situ observations. So this is like things like GPS units, so GPS measurements. This can help validate velocity data, especially in the interior of the ice sheet where it gets more difficult for these feature tracking methods from satellite data to operate as well. Having those GPS-based ground systems for validation is super important and kind of goes into play when we're calculating the uncertainties around these spaceborne velocity estimates. So those are definitely very important. Let's see what else. There's, as far as getting estimates of how much surface melt or surface accumulation happens, it's usually a regional climate model that we get ice sheet wide estimates, but of course those are validated against meteorological stations in places where we have those. Yeah, I think that's the GPS units are really integral, I think, for my research, as well as coming into play now. There's more and more deployments of basal water pressure sensors. So basically trying to understand how much water during the summer season is retained within the ice or how that water is traveling underneath the ice. There's a lot of getting like electronic conductivity of the water and signals and trying to understand how water is flowing through these glaciers over time. That's really fascinating data that I want to be able to work with more here in the future. But having those points, understanding basal water pressure and how that water moves through the system is super important in situ observations as well.
Yeah, that actually raises another question for me from the end of your talk, where you were talking about the different ways that science is communicated to the wider public and other researchers. It's really impressive to see all the different collaborative efforts that are out there to try and make data sets and data products available to the community. Yeah, and this is just, I presume that each one of these groups is really just within the sort of like polar ice community. And I guess I'm curious, do you have any sense for why that particular community seems so open with its data? I mean, I know that tends to vary from community to community, and geophysics in particular, I think, has been pretty good about sharing these data sets, but it's really exciting to see so many independent efforts going on. And I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts on why it seems like why there's so many efforts in the polar ice community.
Well, that is interesting, because you kind of get a narrow focus. Like, I only kind of know what the sense of collaboration is within my field. So it's interesting to hear that maybe geophysics is perhaps unique in that. But I wonder if part of it is just with with sea level rise, and it's in the news, like the polar regions are playing a really crucial part in how the public understands climate change and how sort of necessitates action. That it's sort of that urgency, I think, maybe circles back to the scientists, where we're like, oh, right, we need to get to our answers as fast as possible. And there's so many really brilliant, capable people working on these, sometimes in parallel. So how do we pool all our efforts? And a lot of the funding agencies too have helped kind of promote this with, asking for open science statements, and how are you making the FAIR policies with data production. So really almost making it a necessity. We need to make sure when you're producing this data, it can be accessed and easily explored. I think it also helps promote trust even with people outside of this discipline. If you can, with some, if maybe a couple hours of understanding the data set you're working with, go in and actually explore it yourself, then maybe it builds trust with the scientists and the results that they're putting out there, right?
Yeah, that's all great to hear. We did have a question come in from David, and he's asking, do you have a volume estimate of 1 gigaton of ice, maybe in terms of Olympic-sized swimming pools or something like that? Do you have a way of quantifying how much water that actually is?
Oh, I do somewhere. Let's see if I have it somewhere in my notes here. So I have in my head a lot of this glacier that I showed here. So this is Sumic. I looked up how to pronounce it beforehand. I don't want to do the disservice of putting it on screen now, but this is the largest glacier by ice drained from the ice sheet. And at one point when I lived in Ohio, it was about 2.5 feet of ice slab to cover all of Ohio coming off this glacier.
Oh my gosh.
So divided by 40, we're talking about covering Ohio, maybe 4 millimeters of ice, it'd be 1 gigaton, but I know everyone is from a different area. So the Olympic-sized swimming pool is one I've seen out there. I just, off the top of my head, I'm kind of blanking on that, but yeah.
David had another question here, wondering if you'd be able to share the links to the resources that you mentioned at the end of your talk, and in particular the kind of virtual reality tour of the South Pole Station. If that's something.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I should have included a link here, but I can probably send that to you, Justin, when the videos upload to YouTube within the bio or the section underneath, that all these links will be included, because there's not just the South Pole. There's Peruvian glaciers, there's somewhere the poles. There's probably 6 or 7 of these different field sites that you can explore. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. So we will definitely get that link coupled with the video.
Great. One other question here. Great talk. Thank you for sharing. Are there any ground recordings of GPS or seismic data near the northwest glacier that you showed in your talk. I was thinking if those existed, perhaps those could be sonified to provide a musical background to the glacier flow.
Let's see, the question was about the glacier in the northeast. Was that the
Northwest.
northwest?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah,
The
so
second part, combining it with sounds.
they were wondering if you had any or aware of any ground recordings of that northwestern glacier, and whether those could be sonified or made into some kind of like a musical sound based on the recorded data.
So I'm sure this glacier is a very popular one to study because it is the largest in terms of ice volume. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any here, but I know Helheim, which is kind of the counterpart, a really large glacier on the East Coast. There is a lot of work. There are a lot of studies that look at acoustic data in the fjord. So actually in the water itself, but understanding even wildlife. So which is a biological sound footprint, or so to speak, or a signature versus a calving event. So kind of having cluster analysis of what these different processes sound like. And that can be really, Lee Stearns and Gigaton, I think we're working on this. And there's so many different processes going on, even the mélange, when the mélange breaks up on the surface, how to separate that from the calving at the front, and then freshwater flushing in. And so there actually is a lot of work trying to deconvolve the different processes from an aggregated acoustic signal. As far as kind of like an artistic take on it, that I'm not sure, but that I'm sure somebody has. But that sounds like kind of a fascinating way to bring on even more people into trying to understand the processes at play. Yeah, you should do it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe one final question then. You mentioned in your last answer the talking a bit about the mélange, and I was curious. In your talk, you had showed how at different times that mélange will kind of like wash out to sea, and other times it's sort of like building up. And I was curious to know if like wind or waves have any significant impact on kind of when and how that happens, or I mean, is that a component of what causes the flushing out to occur, or is it governed more by other things?
I think it's still very, we haven't yet mapped or gotten a baseline of the spatial temporal variability of mélange to be able to say, but my assessment is from looking at the data set so far is that it really varies by location. So some locations would be more sensitive. It also depends on the orientation of a fjord relative to kind of circulation coming in or the wind patterns coming in. But some glaciers, especially like on the East Coast, would be more sensitive to like wave propagation. And I would also imagine there's probably a threshold where sea ice, if it's too thick or too thin, or maybe there's probably like a sweet spot where it's just cold enough and the sea ice is just weak enough that waves would be enough to kind of break up the sea ice, which is sort of the glue that sort of holds everything together. And it's also a function of the density of icebergs. So icebergs to sea ice ratio, right? I mean, that can have an impact on the stability of the mélange itself. Yeah, so there's, and also how fast the glacier is flowing. So if a glacier is just, barreling down the fjord, it's a really fast moving glacier. It's pushing against that mélange at all times, right? It's so slower glaciers may have a greater capacity for mélange to kind of form and sort of stay in place longer. So yes, I guess, yeah, probably at some places, and then that plus 8 other things.